What I do know is that wisdom emerges where there's affection for each other, where there's love, where there's a capacity to deal with suffering. And I think that we have begun to embody that. I want to thank Mary, because you went far beyond what you and I talked about for an introduction. And Carol, who has been so gracious. Carol can be very direct. She said, we want someone to connect collective wisdom to transformational leadership, and transformational leadership to depth psychology. What are you doing Sunday morning? Tony, who we thank, but who has taken care of me and with her staff, taken care of all of us. And Stephen, who you'll hear in a bit, who's helped create this city that we're in, and have the privilege of being able to connect to each other and to something deep within us. So I want to begin there. I think this morning for me is a journey, and where will we go? Because you should go somewhere on journeys, right? So we'll start back a couple thousand years ago in Athens. We'll go to the early 1800s in New England. We'll go to the moon and back. We'll take stops in South Africa and India and Tokyo. And we'll end in Toronto. Why Toronto? Because in Toronto was an orchestral production of Four Seasons, but the reimagining of it so that musicians from India and China and Inuit throat singers were brought together to reimagine Vivaldi. I hope this doesn't sound too linear. I mean, depth psychology, it's like... and we're also going to do something, I hope, as a group. We're going to break some of the forms, and we're going to physically move some of the chairs around. And what I want you to, as a metaphor for us to work with, is if you break a system, you need to know how to put it back together. And so our test, not mine, our test, is that we can figure out a way to break the form, but put it back together, so look around so it is exactly like it is. And if we come close but not perfect, I hope some people will stay for a few minutes and assist to put that form back together. But we can use it as our metaphor. So let's travel. It's important we take up the question of what is wisdom. And one of the great wisdom stories in the Western tradition is about high stakes. A man is accused of preaching corrupting youth, preaching about false gods, preaching that there are no gods, and the sentence is death. And he gets to defend himself. It's our friend Socrates. Plato, we know Socrates through Plato's writing. This is no apologia. This is a man who is going to put his life forward for his beliefs. And while he might want to ingratiate himself to his audience, you see little of that. He starts by telling them that the whole thing doesn't make sense. He's been accused of corrupting youth for false gods and having no gods, and that's logically inconsistent. And the first thing he has to do is tell them he's been accused of wisdom and he needs to explain himself. He's been accused of wisdom because during that time, wisdom was associated with persuasion. And so they should be careful that he could lead them to false conclusions through skillful rhetoric. And he says, I'd rather die than do that. If what I say to you reveals the truth, then so be it. But to use rhetoric to convince you of something that may be not true is against everything I believed. But he says, it is true that I have been accused of wisdom, so I need to tell you the story. A colleague of mine went to the Delphic Oracle. The Delphic Oracle, of course, was the priestess who spoke about fate and destiny, and she was asked, is Socrates the wisest in the land? And yes, the answer came. Socrates was the wisest. How the hell did that happen, Socrates thinks. I can't be the wisest in the land. I'm so aware of what I don't know. So he created a social action research project. This is how his mind worked. He said, I will go to all those who are considered wise, and certainly then I'll be able to disprove it. He had to take it seriously. He had to take the oracle seriously. But here he would have a way of confirming that it could not be true. So he chose first a politician that had been greatly admired. And he met with the politician. Socrates had a way of pissing people off, but that's a separate story. He talks with the politician, and he leaves, and he says, this politician wasn't wise, except maybe in his own mind. He knew nothing that could really change things, or nothing that could take us to a better place. Well, it can't be the politicians. I'll go to the poets and the playwrights, because here there's no argument that they have given voice to wisdom. And so he meets with the poets and the playwrights. And he's struck by, yes, their work is brilliant, but they had nothing more to say about it than anyone else. That they could somehow act as a conduit for wisdom, but it didn't necessarily have anything to do with their wisdom. So now he's getting antsy, and he's going to go to the craftspeople, the people who work with metal and weaving and art, because certainly they had wisdom. They could create these products. And he speaks with them, and he is duly impressed about what they know about their craft. But beyond that, he finds no wisdom. And now he begins to make a connection. That if the oracle spoke a truth, it was contained in this research. That what differentiated Socrates from these others is he knew what he didn't know. His ignorance, or his consciousness of ignorance, was what freed him to explore and what could be called wisdom. Now, in a moment, we're going to say that this doesn't mean you can go around saying, I don't know, and people are going to call you wise. I say this because I've tried it, and it doesn't work. To know the limits of one's knowledge. I took this photograph of a colleague and mentor, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was the World Wisdom Chair at Naropa. At 80 years old, we began a project to work in group with subtle energies and other than human intelligences. At 80 years old, I would ask him what he wanted to do, and he would just say, this is what I've always wanted to do before I die, to start this exploration. And I don't know what we'll find. What an amazing way to stay alive and curious, to be constantly in the inquiry. And I keep this picture in my office because it's a reminder that it's through humility and humor that we retain the resilience, we retain the capacity for inquiry. There was a methodology to Socrates' work, and it's a methodology that's actually familiar to all of us who work with dialogue and inquiry. But there's some twists in it that really bring us into the depth psychology arena. The first is wisdom is discovered by challenging our certainty. What Socrates was brilliant at is deconstructing things, taking things apart. In one case, a student would tell him of this other teacher, and he'd say, oh, that's wonderful. Tell me everything he said. And he'd repeat it, and he said, you know, I only find maybe one little problem. It could be a little shorter. So he offers a summary of it, which is much more condensed. Then he finds something else maybe a little bit not quite right. And then it sort of leads up to, there's one more thing. It's completely wrong. And he confronts people with the deconstruction of their certainty. And it's from that space that something else can be born. And how? Through dialogue with people who share that willingness to explore, to not know, and also to put forward what they do know. And so the power of that. But it's the third piece that I think often gets lost when people talk about, I use the Socratic method, there's no answers. It's just not the case with Socrates. This is all based on his believing that the soul has a memory, that all learning is memory. That this wouldn't make any sense if we couldn't see it and recall it, and that the work of dialogue is to flush it out until we begin to see it together. It's a beautiful way to think about what dialogue is doing. That it's helping us remember. And he could say this because he viewed, as Matthew Fox said, that the body was contained in the soul. And if you emphasize the body too much in its senses, you will distract yourself from allowing the soul's memory to be revealed. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the major influences behind the Collective Wisdom Initiative and the book, The Power of Collective Wisdom. And I'm going to take us now to the early 1800s, to New England. You may wonder how I have a picture of it. I was invited to an arboretum in Minneapolis for a new play called Nature. And the person who wrote it and acted was Emerson's great-great-great-grandson. Emerson's words had carried through time. And it was about the relationship between him and Thoreau. In Nature, he ends the book with those famous words, build therefore your own world. Build therefore your own inner world. Because from that inner world, you will be able to create and you'll be able to transform things. In man, the perpetual progress is from the individual to the universal, from that which is human to that which is divine. That's what propelled Emerson's thinking, and he was really the first in the West to begin to integrate the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads from the East. To imagine in that period of time for him to read those works and connected it to the human experience of being in America in the early 1800s. It is the work, I think, that has been throughout our time here, that leadership without the cultivation of that inner world is at the mercy of the forces outside of itself. And that we're not just building a better committee. We're on a journey from our human experience to the universal experience. And everyone has and can take that journey. The other key assumptions underneath the power of collective wisdom has to do with myth and archetype. Myths do, and this is Campbell talking, has a twofold capacity. To touch us psychologically and also tap into something metaphysical. And that's what distinguishes myth. It's the organization of symbols, narrative, images. You've been hearing this, right? I'm not saying this for the first time. But what I do want to tell you is a story of Campbell when he was doing his book tour and what he confronted and his humor and insights. he was on this radio show, and he was doing a book tour, and he had been sweating out the question, what is myth? And he had developed this really kind of long, explanatory concept. So he sits down into this radio interview, and the radio guy says, I'm going to be tough on you. I've been trained in law. Radio show begins. He says, what is myth? Campbell says, well, it's the organization of image, form, narrative in a particular context and social. And the guy says, myth is a lie. Myth is a lie. And they are off and running. Near the end of the show, Campbell has this great insight. He realizes he can't talk about myth if metaphor is not understood. Although Campbell says metaphor because we're both from New York. So he says to the guy, do you know what a metaphor is? The guy says, give me an example. Campbell says, I've been teaching for 35 years. You give me an example. And Campbell says in his talking about this, if you've ever seen a building collapse, you saw what I saw. It disoriented him, and he struggled, and he couldn't find it. And now, moments before the show closes, he says, if Mike runs really fast, you could say he runs like a deer. Campbell says that's not a metaphor. He is a deer. And the guy says, that's a lie. And the show ends. This is what it means to go in the world with mythic consciousness. It's not real. And so part of the inner work, part of the cultivation in places like this, is you have to have some appreciation of what it is, of what real is, of how metaphor affects human systems. I wasn't sure if I'd use this, but Jung goes through this. There's a counterpart to the story during Jung's time with the Red Book, which he knows he sort of doesn't know if he's losing his mind or not. And he talks about how almost everything he wrote came out of these years of his paintings and his writings. And this is from the Red Book, where he is confronted by a guide, Elijah. And he just doesn't know what to do. It's as if it's a real figure that he's talking to, with responses that he is not any longer believing is in his own agency. And Elijah tells him, you may call us symbols for the same reason that you can also call your fellow men symbols, if you wish to. But we are just as real as your fellow men. You invalidate nothing and solve nothing by calling us symbols. And Jung says exactly what I think some of us, all of us at times, have been plunged into during this last few days and in our lives. He says, you plunge me into a terrible confusion. Do you wish to be real? And Elijah answers, we are certainly what you call real. We are certainly what you call real. Here we are, and you have to accept us. The choice is yours. We have data from what might be called an imaginal realm, an arena that goes beyond just our imagination, an area, what can be called archetypes of forms that reveal themselves in the human being and in groups. And the moment we forget they are real, we become subject to their powers. I think this is why one of the questions Campbell asks that has so profoundly affected me is he says, we live in relationship to a system. Is the system going to relieve you of your humanity, or are you going to use the system for human purposes? This is the challenge. This is the dilemma of being in organizations. You're constantly called into some form of compromise trap. You have to figure some way out to retain your integrity and either stay or leave the system. But it's this question that guides it. At what point do we just give up on our reason for bringing our human purposes to play? This was also, I think, so embedded in Matthew Fox's work. So I want to show you this is based on Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants. It's a way that helped me as I was organizing data to think about what I was confronting. This first part, individual exterior, is where we live most of the time. My physical appearance, my biography, I'm Alan Briskin. My parents were born in Eastern Europe. I was born in Manhattan. I was a delivery boy. I went on to school. I did some of the things she said. I get attached to my story. Now, if I think this is the only domain to live in, and I don't get into one of the 5 top schools, then I may contemplate suicide, and I may think my parents would probably be relieved. The suffering of being only in this domain. I don't mean it's all suffering. Most of it's really fun. And you meet people and you say, you like Bruce Springsteen, I like Bruce Springsteen, let's get married. You know, you can stay in that exteriority. But often, what Angelus Arian calls the divine haunting, why Jung thought people should come into therapy only at a certain age, is because something begins to grate, and we are faced with an interiority. 110 years ago, through the mechanisms of dreams, Freud wrote about this, published in 1900. It was a huge success. Almost 600 books were sold in the first 2 years. When people weren't ignoring it, they were criticizing it, revolted by it. But if you recall, it was not just about dreams, it was the royal road to the unconscious. And where Jung and Freud split, I think, is around the nature of that interiority. That while it is made up of fears and fantasies and repressions, it also has these other elements. This interiority is of beauty. And when we learn to look out on the world from an inner stance of beauty, it changes how we actually perceive things. But there's something limiting still about the individual quadrants. One, because we have no choice but to work in the exteriority of the collective. And the collective, in a similar way, is the physical appearance. It's the buildings we walk into and how we feel when we walk into them. It's the social institutions. It's the codification of principles. Enron, right? Enron, the corrupted, it's out of business, had one of the great mission and ethics statements around. They were winning awards for it. We've been hearing about the professor at Yale who wrote a book and who was criticized by the Vatican. In this concept, the exterior is the codification, and you never get away from the codification. And then you have wars over the codifications. So her book was actually titled Just Love, a Framework for Christian Sexual Ethics. And the Vatican, paraphrasing Tina Turner, said, what's love got to do with it? The Vatican asserted that according to church teachings, masturbation is an intrinsically and gravely disordered action. So now you know what happened to me. I think that's funny. Homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. Providing gay marriage would not only signal approval of deviant behavior, but would obscure the value of traditional marriage. This is the codification. When I went to Japan to talk about death and dying, I was informed that it was very difficult to talk about death in Japan. Here, the home of Buddhism. Why in these Western-style hospitals was hard? Because the doctor would feel it was awkward to bring this up to the family. And the elder would feel it was awkward to put his children in such a position. And the children could never violate their regard for their parent by bringing it forward. So the question is, how do you enter into that system? What angle do you take? And then along the way, she said about hospices. I said, hospices, I know hospices. Hospices is that created system that helped people, had the imagination to deal with death and dying. And she says, no, here it's mostly about staffing ratios. It's this exteriority. It's anything gets pushed there. And so I want to now point to the interiority, because I think this is an equivalent of what Freud was dealing with in 1900. I think we don't know that it will be 100 years to know more about the nature of this collective interiority. What we do know, or we're beginning to know, is that if we could begin to name the things that happen in the individual quadrants and in the collective exterior, what is unique about the interiority, just like the interiority of an individual, is it comes to us in a different language. It is about energy. It's about images. It's about archetypes. But not the codifications of it, the lived experience of it in groups. What Arthur and Pilar are doing, and it's often so difficult, is let us see how in a few minutes and hours the scapegoat will rise among us. The living archetype, which is so easy to talk about, is now among us. And what are we going to do? And by the way, I don't have a bunch of rules for this. In groups, what it means is my attention to the social field, to the energy, to the language people use. Because I don't know where I am within the interior of any group, and the interior is constantly shifting. A story and a little bit of someone to speak to us. In 1999, when we were first doing the Collective Wisdom Initiative, we met at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma. It just moved to that campus. It was a former university campus for international students. And we were bringing the data we had of all the stories about transformation of organizations. And it was in the evening, we were drinking wine and laughing and having a good time. And I had this thought, I'd love to have a cigarette. You know, this is the time to have a cigarette. I don't really smoke, but if I see one, I smoke. Just then, from across the way, I see the ember of a cigarette. And I see the ember of a cigarette. And I think, wouldn't it be great if whoever that is came over? And this ember starts moving toward us. And I'm thinking, this stuff really works. Mind, matter. What the hell? What can I do now? This is just the beginning. This guy walks in, you know, somewhat casually dressed. I say, can I have a cigarette? Somehow the idea of introducing myself or any of that goes out the window. Can I have a cigarette? And he taps his pockets, and he said, I left my cigarettes back. And Tom Callanan, who, this was way before any of us thought of doing the book, but Tom Callanan and Charles Erickson, John Ott, my co-authors of Power of Collective, they were all there. And John hits me on the shoulder and he says, do you know who this is? Like, I'm supposed to, Did he have a cigarette? He said, this is Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and he was the Apollo 14 astronaut who walked on the moon. Oh. It's fine about the cigarette, don't worry about it. Cheryl, who had that art of asking the innocent question, said, was there anything about your trip to the moon that had a relationship to the Institute of Noetic Sciences? And therein lies the tale, because he begins to tell us of coming back. And while I later learned he's told this story many, many, many times, when he was telling us, a tear came up in his eye, and he was right back there. And while I don't have the video of our interaction, I do have a video of his describing the story in a documentary called Shadows of the Moon. And I want to show that to you now.
The biggest joy was on the way home. In my cockpit window, every 2 minutes, the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and the whole 360-degree panorama of the heavens. And that was the powerful, overwhelming experience. And suddenly I realized that the molecules of my body and the molecules of the spacecraft and the molecules in the body of my partners were prototyped and manufactured in some ancient generation of stars. And that was an overwhelming sense of oneness, of connectedness. It wasn't them and us, it was, that's me, that's all of it, it's one thing. And it was accompanied by an ecstasy, a sense of, oh my God, wow, yes, an insight, an epiphany.
We are all teaspoons of stardust. Literally. And so it may be possible that our memory of home is indeed the cosmos. I showed this a year back, and afterwards an elderly man called me over and he said, Epiphany, and he kept saying something. Finally, I thought I discovered what he was saying, and I said, Epiphany, you mean epiphany? He said, yeah, I was speaking in Greek. Oh. He said, epi means closest. Closest, like epicenter. And phantasm is the other part, but in this context, it means closest to the highest spirit. And I think there are moments, not just when we're coming back to the moon, when we feel closest to the highest spirit in ourselves. And this becomes a way of being present with people, because it's possible to be with the highest spirit in ourselves. It's not accidental, the name of the Institute of Noetic Science. Nous was a language used to describe an area in the heavens and beyond of an intelligence that was separate from human intelligence. Archetype has many different origins, but certainly one of them is this notion of a source, in Plato's words, at the ridge of heaven where the procession of gods go. And they encounter a colorless, formless, intangible essence. Try telling that to your supervisor. A good supervisor, that shouldn't be hard. We'll have a metric for that. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is named after that concept, and while it can be found in the dictionary as reason or intelligence, it has to do with the intuitive mind, of feelings and intuition and being able to discern through that kind of intelligence. It's an intelligence that is known to all of you as intuitives and is an aspect of everyone's intelligence, although it can be often subordinate. So I want to say that there is something that could be called applied from this kind of consciousness. There's going to be three areas that I talk quickly about, but one is emergence. That the human skill is the ability to look upon order, to see the beauty and order arising from what may appear at first as chaotic and disturbing. And you know what happens when people first encounter chaotic and disturbing. They want to fix it, they want to run from it, they want to fight with each other about it. And so we're talking about psychic core that is to be developed. Because you're not going to be able to leave this room and last very long without encountering chaos. And the response to chaos is to be aware that there's pattern and that we could do that in groups. And it happens subtly and all the time. I mean, the last night, 65 people showed up. Carol and her group were still deciding how to make the form work 7 minutes before. Actually, 2 minutes before. Right. That's right. And in many ways, groups have to work that way. This is where the collision of, well, we have to process this. We have to, really understand what's behind here. Well, there's 65 people waiting for us in that room. One can practice working with the skills of emergence. The creation of sacred space. An understanding that there are moments and spaces where two worlds flow into each other. The visible with the invisible, the finite world touches the infinite. Again, I don't think one has to travel to the moon to experience this. This was constantly my experience in the midst of prisons, public schools, hospitals, ICUs. But we have to look for it. We have to know that we need some of that to keep us through all the rest. There is a story of a philanthropist who is overtly your stereotyped capitalist. He reveled in his money, and in some ways he reveled in being able to give money away as a philanthropist. And I was beginning to have just a little bit of judgment. Have you ever had this feeling? And then he tells a story about how he helped in what became a new kind of wheelchair because one of his assistants, their adult son, was blind and unable to, and was not mobile. And so this became a big deal, and they were able to manufacture them and send them around the world. So that was good, and that's part of his philanthropic orientation. But then he tells the story of meeting the man. He says the man pulls him down so they're face to face, unable to see. And he says, the next time we meet, it will be in heaven. The next time we see each other, it will be in heaven. And it just stopped me. All the judgment just sort of subsided for a moment. Fortunately, I was able to judge him again later on in the talk. But you have these spaces where something surprising occurs. And finally, dialogue, which we've talked so much about, but I want to point to the players. Arthur and I, who were working with Eliane from Rwanda, and I was working with Yuka from the Peace Foundation in Japan, that there needed to be a different kind of way that leaders could meet. And so we did it at the Commonwealth Bolinas retreat. And there was such a connection between these two women who had never met before. And it was so wondrous. And there was things you could have never guessed that would have emerged, except they did. that Yuka had always carried around a thought that since she had somewhat of a privileged background, could she really represent a peace network without the direct relationship to suffering? And here was Eliane, coming from Rwanda, saying, of course, we need you. But it's this shared meaning that can be a function of dialogue. I think Farrar was so wonderful in your point, Mary. It's not a technique. It's maybe a skill, but it's not a technique. It's a way of knowing. The questions I want to leave with you, and we'll say just a little bit about them, because this is the work for you to go out in the world, is can fields be sensed? Can fields shift? Can fields be transformed? You may ask, what do you mean by fields? Well, I happen to have wrote that down. In the physical world, a field may be thought of as extending throughout the whole of space, exerting force through direction, magnitude, and momentum. In physics, it's associated with the physical fields of gravity, electromagnetism, and the weak and strong nuclear fields. It's a spatial concept. It's that information is existing in the field, in this space, influenced by each heartbeat, each thought. It's important to think that in the physical world, gravity, which we know so well, how quickly I could stumble, is the weakest of all these forces, by far. That the strong nuclear field, the reason it could create atomic energy is because of the energy it takes to split it apart. Its power is in its staying together. And if you think about it metaphorically, some of the most protracted social fields, they explode if you try to pull out from the status quo that they're in, which is why one has to be skillful at taking things apart. Archetypal fields are also informational fields, and when leaders are identified with them, there can be extraordinary things that happen. It's hard to talk with me for any length without me saying that there's also dangers to this. What Jung was so brilliant at is he understood the nature of possession. Imagine, unmitigated, that you become the archetype of justice. And now you look onto that exterior world, and you're the archetype of justice. Unabomber kind of danger. But even like Kuan Yin, you're the archetype of compassion. How much are you going to give away before there's nothing left inside of you? So the psychological maturity that we need to develop is indeed in order to be able to be conduits of these larger fields. Some of the people who have affected collectively the social fields are the artists and poets. They do it from the side. They do it through beauty. They do it through provoking new ways of seeing. And there are also those who do it through social activism. To go back to Emerson, this is Emerson and Thoreau in the 1830s. I know it's color, but you could colorize anything. One of the great stories is he was a mentor to Thoreau, and he gave Thoreau the land on Walden Pond. He's in his Walden Pond, and then he decides to not pay taxes because he's in protest of the Mexican War and slavery, and they throw him in jail. The story goes that Emerson came and said, "What are you doing in there?" And Thoreau says, "What are you doing out there?" That tension of how we are going to affect the field. Thoreau writes an essay on civil disobedience. 30 years later, an Indian man in South Africa, Mohandas Gandhi, reads this treatise and leaps the bound from the individual to the collective and sees in it civil disobedience as a social movement. Howard Thurman, who's been mentioned here a number of times, an African theologian, in 1935 goes to visit Gandhi. He asks Gandhi if he'd come and talk about civil rights in the U.S. And Gandhi says, "Not so fast. I have my work here." And he specifically says, "I have my work here because the vitality of these ideas have not yet entered into the collective." But if these ideas of nonviolence and adherence to truth with firmness are to go to the United States, it will be through an African American. Thurman returns with that. And in the 1940s, the midst of the end of World War II, starts an intercultural, intergenerational, interreligious church in San Francisco with Germans and Asians, and begins to enact the vitality of the collective. And it's from those years, he writes, Jesus and the Disinherited. And he's appointed the first African-American minister at Boston University, where he happens to stumble on the son of one of his former classmates, which was Martin Luther King. We're now in about 1953. 2 years later, Rosa Parks is not just physically tired, she's spiritually tired, and she's not moving anymore. And it initiates the protest. Martin Luther King is sitting next to Glenn Smiley, a white minister teaching nonviolence. And thus begins a story we know. A year later, Nelson Mandela is put in prison. He was aware and somewhat skeptical of Gandhi's work, but begins to reevaluate that and finds a key that will lock the horror and hostility that is in South Africa. Some things to be aware of: that Social Fields is inclusive of myself and you and the setting and the physical setting. Right? So we're really talking about a different way of understanding groups. Why helping them rewrite their value statement can be a step, but a precarious one if one is not sensitive to the social field you're in. Social fields can be shaped by generations of pain, oppression, and suffering. You all know this. You can throw whatever you want at it, but if the gravitational hold is on victimization, is on finding an oppressor, they will be able to find it not only outside, that's easy, they'll find it among us. And the kind of pain and suffering that occurs in these groups is the data about the social field. This, by the way, was by an artist friend of mine. I asked him to draw me a group of an ecstatic group, and he comes back with this. And he said, I'll get there, but I just had to do this first. I thought it was great. It's like, yeah, you got to do this first. This, by the way, is Jung's image of the shadow, of the interior individual, interior collective. Loving social fields are generated through conversation, intimacy, and human connection. I had the privilege of going into Tohoku, the northern part of Japan, where there has been the devastation by tsunami and earthquake. And Yuka was with us, and we're standing in this midst of this pain. And I turn my head, and she's laughing and running around with these kids. On that trip was Bill Strickland, who is an extraordinary man, developed vocational centers in Pittsburgh and around the world. And we're together, and he's there because they want him to look into creating a vocational center. There's just a point where the reality of the situation starts weighing on him. And I took the picture, and I had this picture of Martin Luther King on my desk. And he's still working on it. They're still working on doing this vocational center in Tohoku. But what heart it takes to stay with it. brief comment that the information is already in our DNA. At the beginning of the 1920s, Mary Parker Follett talked and advanced the theory of power with as opposed to power over. She was not a utopian. She didn't say this would be the new world. She said, what if we found more and more ways to have power with each other? And by doing that, draining all the attention from the hierarchies that tell us that power over is the only strategy that can be used. In the 1980s, Mary Belenky, my mentor in the 1970s, who Mary talked about, together with her colleagues, wrote a book called Women's Way of Knowing. And in it, she followed, I don't think she had any knowledge of Mary Parker Follett work, that the expert, the leader, are in differentiate roles. I get careful when people say, leaderless groups, we don't need any leaders. I don't even understand it. Leadership, its origins are the words to go somewhere. If you're a leaderless group, it guarantees you won't go anywhere. I know what it's meant to mean, but I'm playing with the language on purpose to give you a caution about the idealization of if we could only get rid of hierarchy, if we could only get rid of leaders, we'll all be singing and dancing in the street. I loved what Mary and her colleagues said about this, that experts, leaders, or someone whose answers reflect the complexity of the situation. I think much of the attention to Carol has been she exemplifies this. She's always working with the complexity of the situation, never letting herself or anyone else off the hook. I put this in, Gina, because we talked about it. I had a chance to photograph at the Aikido headquarters. The founder of Aikido was an extraordinary man, and my translation of Aikido is the path of joining with universal life energy. And I asked the grandson, the current dosho, if Aikido was a true martial art, and he said yes, and then pointed me to how I could understand that. Budo, the word in Japan for martial art, literally means to put a stop to contending spears. Imagine if that was our task as warriors. Even in the act of taking someone's energy and putting them down. A colleague who's a black belt in Aikido said, you know the difference when a master takes you down and a novice, because the master takes you down softly. This allows me to say what you now already know, that these were the stances we talked about in collective wisdom. You now, I think, have some new ways to think about deep listening. What story do I want to tell? How do I really hear the heartbeat of the other? How do I suspend certainty? And by the way, I have trouble suspending certainty. I do it in part because a group can't mature unless some of us at least, will acknowledge that we don't have the right answers for the group. Seeing whole systems, forcing out what people would rather not have to look at. Respect for others. I think this is the big one for us. It's so easy to talk about respect, principle, respect. Put 4 stars next to support, respect, we really want that. It takes 15 seconds to be pissed off at someone else in a group. And sometimes 30 years to get over it. Respect is not something that just happens, it's a discipline. Welcoming all that arises. Realizing that we don't control all the aspects, even as we try to design systems to work. And trusting in that larger force, the transcendent element, however we want to call it, God, infinite, rational, atheist, which is a transcendent force. Rational? I haven't seen it. I want to end, before we break into the group situation, with an embodiment of this. This comes from a woman in Toronto preparing to do Four Seasons, Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and she gets this cockamamie idea. She's going to invite musicians from China and India with instruments that are not part of the Western canon, and just to make it hard, Inuit throat singers who have no instrument and don't read music. I'm going to give you the first intro to it, and then I'm going to show you a bit more of a section of it, and then we'll see what kind of time we have to work together.
In every culture, life is expressed through music. And since in every culture there are seasons, something about the seasons is expressed through music in every culture. They're expressing the same things as we all are, but we're all singing our own individual songs and speaking it in our own languages. And yet we can understand each other's languages. That's the miracle of music. To have 4 different ancient cultural traditions coming together and celebrating their way of making music, it's very, very unique.
Well and good. Lovely. There's a fly in the ointment. How do you get the Inuits to integrate into this music? I'm going to show you as a small clip. I gave Tony the information on how to get this DVD. I recommend it. It's absolutely extraordinary. But the section I'm going to show you is where they struggle over how to come in and how they begin to move forward. And it's with that I'm going to take us into reforming the group, okay?